I'm Katie Osuna, and I'm the host of Copper and Heat Radio, a 2-time James Beard Award-winning podcast about the forces that shape our meals. I started this podcast back in 2019 when I was working in Michelin-starred restaurants and noticing all of these social interactions around me. I had a lot of questions about the culture of restaurants and the systems we operated in.
I think the restaurant world's in for a reckoning.
Restaurants are slow to change because everything's made on the smallest margins.
Value is completely arbitrary, right?
What began as a podcast to process my way through working in kitchens as a woman has grown.
If the conversation is a crackdown on the border, then do you want a $30 burger? Because that's one of the consequences of this.
There's just a certain financial reality to making certain businesses exist. And there's a reason that delivery didn't exist in a lot of markets for a lot of years. And it's because it's incredibly low margin.
How a cuisine climbs in prestige and value. This happened to Japanese cuisine. This happened to Italian cuisine right in front of our eyes.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts. And now on Heritage Radio Network.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Yeah. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways, hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey.
Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. On today's episode, we have the author of Insatiable City, Food and Race in New Orleans, published by University of Chicago last year. I am so excited, y'all, to have this conversation with Dr. Theresa McCulla. Now, as we begin this conversation, I just wanted to kind of set the tone for what we will discuss today. Since its inception, there's always been a lure and mystique to New Orleans for many outsiders and tourists. Many years ago, I was in the Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina, and a group of tourists riding their bike toured the devastated, once vibrant Black community of majority, middle, and working class. It broke my heart to see that despair and death was now a tourist attraction. So it is no surprise that the cachet word resilient is always mentioned when something tragic happens in New Orleans. But this isn't anything new. In Dr. Theresa McCulla's book, Insatiable City, Food and Race, New Orleans, she discusses many of these topics. McCulla delves deep into the history of culinary tourism, mostly in antebellum New Orleans. Y'all, McCulla's book is a triumph, a view into a period of time that is very personal to me and many. My great-great-grandmother, Alice Palmer, was an enslaved cook, sold from Virginia during the domestic slave trade when she was 14 years old. When I asked Dr. Ibrahim Seck, academic director at the Whitney Plantation, if my great-great-grandmother was shipped from Virginia during the domestic slave trade, what he told me kept me up at night. He said she was most likely walked. That's correct, walked. Most enslaved persons were from other parts of the South as well. Great-grandmother Alice, like many others held in bondage, was sold from Virginia to add to the necessary field and luxury labor in the economic powerhouse of New Orleans and Louisiana after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. Enslaved cooks were sold for up to $1,500, about $58,000 today. I wondered, was she listed as a tolerable or excellent cook, a term used to advertise the sale of humans at a discounted or premium price with culinary skills? Since she was sold from Virginia, she had to learn Creole cuisine to adapt to a mostly French-speaking city. I give reverence to her today for this episode as we talk with Dr. Theresa McCulla, an acclaimed curator, professor, and writer. Antebellum New Orleans food history is the most profound era to understand the making of an American cuisine and prolific culture. When I reviewed Insatiable City, I felt a sense of relief that this New Orleans story with the Black hand in the pot is now told in such a profound way. Insatiable City embodied a lot of the research I conducted many years ago for my 2016 Story of New Orleans Creole Cooking, the Black Hand in the Pot documentary. I'm so grateful that she listed my documentary in her bibliography. So thank you for that. And we welcome Dr. Theresa McCulla.
Thank you so much for that welcome. And I just appreciate your comments and your reading so much. And am very glad to learn more about your ancestor, Alice. This is all a really amazing kickoff to the conversation. So thank you for all of those things.
So in the beginning of your book, you talked about a slave ship. And there's a lot of conversation about some of the food items that were brought on slave ships. Were they for consumption to keep enslaved Africans alive to make that long journey? Or were they, these crops were they brought to plant in the New World? I would love to kind of just set the tone, just focusing on some of these slave ships that came to New Orleans in the early part of its founding.
Sure. Yeah. So the book unintentionally it begins and ends with rice, with this important ingredient, but also with the people who cultivated it and prepared it and served it. And so, yes, I begin with this particular ship named the Aurore. It was a French slave ship that departed from France in 1718, arrived on the west coast of Africa. 201 people were purchased as enslaved people in West African ports, and then made the transatlantic journey directly to Louisiana. And this was the first ship bearing enslaved Africans to arrive directly from African ports to Louisiana. And also in the hold of this particular ship was rice. And so it was it seemed to epitomize really amazingly the entwined histories and material culture too of this long story that would really begin in the earliest days of enslavement in Louisiana, but the people and the food together arrived on Louisiana soil at that early time.
And in the book, you also talked a lot about Creole. And now Creole has many definitions and identities throughout history. So how did you define Creole throughout your book, and why is it important to American gastronomy?
Yes, that's a great and big and essential question. And it did become an important thread that was really drawn throughout the history of the book. And so if you wanted to maybe distill it to the simplest way to explain it, you might say Creole food is the food of New Orleans. But of course, the history of this word and the food and the people have been anything but simple. And so, but it became a very useful lens for me to explore, to look at this multi-generational and really multi-century history, because I think it sheds light on just the kind of the ephemeral nature of very subjective and changing ideas that are race and ethnicity and gender. Those change over time. They are defined by the people who might use them or not to talk about themselves. But also when we talk about food and experiences of eating and drinking, I mean, that's one reason why, as a subject, it has often been either not so much picked up by scholars to really try to consider critically and to investigate carefully, but it's something that's also very hard to pin down. But Creole, when we think about it, it does unite these histories of people and food and race in this city over a broad stretch of time. And so initially the term Creole was very much a geographic identifier in the 17th and 18th centuries in Louisiana and in other colonized places. It was used to distinguish people who were born in the so-called New World, to distinguish them from people born in, say, Europe or Africa. But over time, pretty quickly, it came to have cultural connotations, linguistic connotations. So, for example, when New Orleans became American as part of the Louisiana Purchase in the early years of the 19th century, the old guard who were in New Orleans as these Americans were flooding into this new frontier town, there was certainly a kind of animosity that developed between the two groups. And so those who were there before the Americans identified as Creoles. They were primarily French-speaking, mostly Catholic. They were of European, but also African, Afro-Caribbean mixed lineages. So certainly at this time still did not have anything very specific to do with race. But it's really in the aftermath of the Civil War that I think you see this critical period when there was a hardening line between Black and white, new understandings of what race meant throughout the United States, and certainly in settings that were rapidly segregating. And so here during these late decades of the 1800s, you see white New Orleanians who identified as Creoles purposefully excising people of African descent, even those who had long identified as Creoles, trying to excise them from the Creole identification. And one source where you see this happening quite clearly is in guidebooks. So, again, this coincides with the early rise of tourism to New Orleans in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so white guidebook authors, many of whom had a hand in the culinary world, some of them published cookbooks or later even cocktail books, would imagine that they were addressing a visitor from maybe the northern United States or Europe, and would purposely define the Creole as quote unquote pure white, someone who was descended from this very romanticized aristocratic French and Spanish past. And this was in part kind of cultural project, but also as the New Orleans economy was really coming to rely increasingly on tourism, it gained a new economic dimension, this exclusion. And so if you have tourists flocking to New Orleans, fine dining Creole restaurants, or really respecting this unique culture, who was a Creole, who was not a Creole, came to have dimensions related to belonging, to creativity, and so I should note throughout all of these eras that people of color of African descent in New Orleans who identified as Creoles never acquiesced to this kind of exclusion, and we find multiple examples throughout different eras of people in the kitchen and out of the kitchen proudly identifying as Creoles, as identifying their cooking as Creoles. So it's a word and a concept that has as long a kind of winding history as the cuisine in the city.
And I always tell people that, just like we all call ourselves Americans today, at one time, in Louisiana, everyone was Creole. Mm-hmm. It's very simple to understand in that way, for people who kind of struggle with the idea of Creole. And of course, like you said, it has changed, definitions throughout time, but it is a culture that continues. And so, you studied Romance languages, and so how does the history of New Orleans intersect with the romancing of slavery?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, because I came to this project. My undergraduate studies were not in history. As you mentioned, I studied Romance languages, French, Spanish, and Italian, and I think I was interested in studying languages because I saw those. I see language and as one of the building blocks of communication, and that is the most essential, but sometimes the hardest thing to do. And so, as I began to study languages, quickly you find it's not just vocabulary and grammar. Of course, it's literature and culture, and slang and expressions, and just the food and everything that goes along with studying different cultures. But had also been interested long in food too, and went to culinary school, and ended up coming ultimately to this project. But yes, as you mentioned, as a historian of food, I'm familiar with New Orleans longstanding reputation, as you mentioned in the introduction, as a city known as the Big Easy, or the city that care forgot, a place where visitors can really kick back and eat and drink and enjoy purportedly simple pleasures. But at the same time, as an American historian, as through my graduate study in history, I became familiar with a very different aspect of this particular city, which again is New Orleans' prominence in the American slave trade, the violence that took place after slavery's abolition, and then further on in the 20th century, really public and very vicious fight to keep public schools segregated. So this romanticized history, which again, elements of that, just kind of wanting to question that or really investigate it, does have building blocks in in my original study in languages.
And I loved in the book just how you really talked about sometimes the violence of tourism. And I would love for you to just talk about how culinary tourism was an economic engine during chattel slavery.
Yes, and this and this was so the book begins in the 19th century, and I called the first chapter Block and Table because I felt like these were two physical settings that were very interrelated, maybe unexpectedly so, but really were in many ways the foundations, physical and theoretical, for all that followed. And so this culinary allure for New Orleans, is really at least 200 years old. And in these early years of American New Orleans, you see the construction of luxury hotels, especially the St. Charles Hotel in the American sector, which was on one side of Canal Street, and then the St. Louis Hotel, especially in the French Quarter. And those opened in 1837, 1838. And travelers describe these and related institutions in the area as just these palaces to access and to luxury and to consumption. And these huge complexes had grand ballrooms and dining rooms for men and for women, bar rooms, and but in these particular hotels and elsewhere in New Orleans, in merchants' exchanges, they were kind of these financial and social institutions for businessmen, white businessmen. The auctions of enslaved people, and as well as agricultural tools and equipment and land, these sales took place in bar rooms and in settings where food and drink were served. And it's just an incredibly perverse and very naked exposure of, as you acknowledged too, the violence of consumption. But I think also New Orleans, this public and prominent display of these kinds of auctions in these places was unique. There were other places in the United States, in Philadelphia in the 18th century, where enslaved people would be auctioned in coffee houses. But in most American cities, the public degree of this was really not present. It was unique to New Orleans. But in addition to that, I think that the proximity of sugarcane plantations, the enthusiasm for sugared cocktails, it was really collapsed the people and the commodified people and the experience of tasting the fruits of what their labor would produce. It was all very concentrated in single places and in settings in the city. And so that's where the book begins, is really kind of setting up this early treatment of people and the commodities they made as everything being offered for sale.
So thank you for sharing that, because, when I reflect, sometimes it's quite ominous to walk the streets of New Orleans sometimes and pass Charter Street in the French Quarter, where you can still see the word exchange inscribed on the wall. But at the same time, I feel joy because my lineage survived. And one of the things I find fascinating, in your work and much of the research that I've uncovered as well, is, people from all over came to see, this fascination of slavery. Europeans, they came from Europe, they came from across the US just to see this the system, And you wrote about a young English woman named Frances Milton Trollope, I think I'm pronouncing her last name correct, who visited New Orleans in 1827. Can you talk about what she saw?
Yes. Yeah. So she and others, there is a tradition, history of these 19th century travel logs, and she and others describe the various experiences they had, the meals they had, and but she had this moment in her travel log where she recalled walking around the city, I believe, with her children, and this was during a mid-December visit, and she looked into the back of a house, and there was a kitchen garden there, and she described seeing a young enslaved woman in the garden, and she was working with pepper pods, and she described this interaction as one of really amazement for her, for the visitor. I think in discovering this midwinter garden, but also in encountering this woman as what she described as the first enslaved person that she saw and was able to speak with. And she described the woman offering a pepper to her and to her children, and Trollope was initially concerned that the woman might be punished if she gave the pepper to her, but Trollope took the pepper anyway. And it felt to me, reading it, there were lots of resonances with just this European visitor coming to this, again, so-called New World, of finding a garden blooming in the middle of the winter, of encountering an enslaved woman, and then the ultimate one of the conclusions that Trollope drew from her travels was that slavery was not as monstrous as she had feared. I believe she called it. She really left the United States with this impression that this institution that had a particular reputation among abolitionists in Europe was really not something to be feared, but it was just again, a kind of, such a perverse interaction with lots of layers, I think, of, potential symbolism.
Oh, that's deep. And considering that there were, slave pens all throughout the city,
right.
Open slave pens, but, and it's fascinating to read some of the accounts, Lafcadio O'Hearn, a lot of folks were documenting that time period, but the ones who were often not able to have voice were they actually enslaved.
Right.
So there's a stark difference between the cell of enslaved field hands and cooks. Can you talk about how they fed an insatiable city?
Sure. Yeah. So, and here too, I think is a setting where it makes very clear just the just kind of mathematical calculations and abuses that were enacted on people according to the work that was planned for them by enslavers. And so, and we, as you mentioned, the challenge, I think, as a researcher and a writer is, the people that you are writing about, that you want to write about, often, so often we're not allowed to read and write and author their own histories. And so, I think that compels researchers to try to be as creative as possible to find, some evidence of, their paths and what they might have experienced. And so, in some respects, you can look for things like narratives of formerly enslaved people, autobiographies, but then I think other kinds of sources like municipal records and other things can really help uncover this. But one of these autobiographies of a formerly enslaved person, he described being brought to New Orleans, and shortly before he and others were made to stand on auction blocks, being fed quite well in these slave pens and slave yards. And that was very purposefully for the point of, hoping to make them appear healthy and robust and, able to do the hard labor that would follow a sale. And then as soon as the sale occurred, he said that abundance was just snatched away. And then you find many accounts in these autobiographies of hunger and just desperation that prompted people to certainly try to hunt and cultivate food themselves, but and steal just to be able to have enough food to work. But the yes, as you mentioned, the often women who were domestic workers. There was, in many accounts, a premium placed on skills in the kitchen that their sale prices were driven up if they were able to offer evidence or reputation as a good cook. And so, whether it's at the big luxurious scale of a hotel or even within, very much behind closed doors in a kitchen, good food and the ability and skills to prepare that were valued in monetary terms.
Absolutely. And in my film, I remember interviewing a friend of mine, and he was just, saying about how sought after enslaved cooks were, who had skills and who knew how to speak Creole,
Mm-hmm.
and also who knew how to cook Creole cuisine. Because if you ever, if anyone's ever in town, you go to the Herman Grima house, they do a tour where they talk about urban enslavement, which I highly suggest that, people go to. But let's talk about the branding of Creole cuisine and culture. How was media used as a tool to perpetuate negative stereotypes?
Yes. So yes. So I think you could point especially to, again, the later part of the 1800s. So after the Civil War, and this was the period I referenced earlier when you begin to see a really calculated effort on the part of many white New Orleanians to really differentiate themselves from people of color who also identified as Creoles. And so it's in the 1880s that the first cookbooks appeared that would, claim to be to articulate Creole cuisine. So one written by Lafcadio O'Hearn, and the Picayune's Creole Cookbook. But it's in these kinds of texts, and then guidebooks, and then definitely branding of food in ensuing years that would represent women of color, especially in the kitchen, in particular pejorative stereotypes. And so many of your listeners are likely familiar with the mammy stereotype, and this image, coupled with the idea that culinary creativity and culinary knowledge of women of color in the kitchen was oral and not textual, that was presented in a very demeaning way, conveyed with the idea that it was somehow inexpert and not an uneducated knowledge, which is that existed in the context of these cookbooks being published in the first place because white women needed to understand how to make this food that they had long enjoyed at the hands of others because of the skills of others. And so, again, this is a theme that runs throughout this entire history, the idea of loving the food that is made often by Black New Orleanians in the kitchen, liking the idea of those people in the kitchen, but then attempting to suppress the people themselves or exclude them, commodify their images. It's something that you see throughout this history.
So how did Black media and historical figures like Frederick Douglass respond to much of those advertisements used to romanticize antebellum New Orleans? So how did Black media resist those images?
Right. Yes. So the third chapter of the book focuses on visual culture. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, again, the rise of things like early guidebooks. This was also a time of just, real explosion in new kinds of visual media for Americans, just because of various technological advances in printing and photography, coupled with the industrialization of the U.S., increased movement of people around the country and beyond. And so there's this window of time when a particular photographic technology called stereography came to the fore. And it's this interesting window that kind of this technology was explosively popular during these years, and then just dropped off the map in between photography and then film, which followed it, movies and eventually television. But stereographs were a particular form that enabled people to really view two images side by side and kind of imagine that they saw the portrayed photographs, images in 3 dimensions. And so it was a very kind of immersive experience and new. But people like Frederick Douglass at the time and W.B. Du Bois, eventually Sojourner Truth, all of them in different ways in their eras, they expressed very clearly the importance of visual representation and were completely aware of the negative stereotypes and the power of negative stereotypes that could be conveyed by these visual forms. And it's interesting and challenging because these kinds of things are difficult to quantify. That if someone is looking at or maybe handling a food packaging with a stereotype on it and are exposed to it however many times, how could one quantify or judge when the ideas conveyed by the stereotype are absorbed? But Frederick Douglass especially wrote about the power of photography for good as well. And so he and others, and we see this among Black New Orleanians at the time, sought to harness that technology and to convey the success of their communities and their unified experiences of coming out of Civil War and into freedom and building churches and social clubs and educational institutions. And so there's a parallel heritage of beautiful and really interesting photographic images and books that are produced by Black New Orleanians and Black Americans at the time. And then as we move into the 20th century, then there are different examples, wonderful examples of culinary entrepreneurs who use their food and their cooking in their restaurants, for very political ends too.
And rest in peace, Leah Chase.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then talking about some of those, images that were used to sell products or to bring tourists to New Orleans. A lot of those images were taken from the living street food vendors, the marchands that you could see in cities like New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, and the victualiers, the hot food vendors, and a host of others, from the popcorn man to the oyster man in New Orleans. Can you talk about their role and what the 19th century writer Lafcadio Hearn called a bustling economy?
Sure. Yeah. So this, the street culture of food in New Orleans and many other port cities was very remarked upon by a lot of visitors and writers like Lafcadio Hearn and individuals who sold food on the street or maybe in marketplaces or on the peripheries of markets. It was a very multi-sensory kind of appeal that they offered to people who were unfamiliar with the city. So it was certainly auditory. They had these distinctive calls. They were they marked the memories of New Orleans for a lot of people. And so yes, Hearn and others wrote about women who sold pralines or men who sold chickens in streets, and but this becomes a part of the nostalgia for the city for those who maybe travel there and then move away. But I would argue too that it's a nostalgia for a past era, and there are many interesting kinds of ways that these particular entrepreneurs are depicted. So in some cases, it's sketched illustrations, but the Historic New Orleans collection has a really fascinating array of small wax dolls of food vendors that were created by a Mexican-American family who came to New Orleans and at first created primarily religious figures, but then understanding the tourist economy in a city switched to making these small wax dolls that were very popular among tourists and collectors even far away. So again, I think there's a lot to read into the desire to purchase a small likeness that might sit in a living room and depict a woman sitting and selling pralines or a man selling watermelon. So yeah, it's a clear part of the tours and souvenir economy are these particular food entrepreneurs.
And so, we talked about the street food vendors, the marchands, and cooks that they were, labeled as enslaved cooks, if they were labeled as excellent, they went for a higher price than a tolerable cook. But then you also had bakers. You had those who worked in the coffee houses, and we'll talk about the coffee houses a little bit later. But I would love for you to talk about enslaved Black waiters in private dining rooms as well as in hotels.
Mm-hmm. Yes, as you mentioned, there really any role that you might think of for someone who cultivated, harvested, transported food, served it. There are many different occupations that were held by New Orleanians of color, and so some of these were pastry cooks and chefs and servers in hotels. And these are a category of jobs that were very interesting because New Orleans, especially in the 19th century, its economy was very seasonal. You would have just a huge swing of businessmen and sometimes their wives and daughters who would come through the city in the fall and the winter, the cooler months, which were, when a lot of the economic activity was highest. These visitors would leave during the spring and summer for fear of yellow fever. And so these hotels and larger institutions needed workers to serve those hungry people during those times. And it's interesting, some of the sources describing these large hotels, some of the travelers who passed through them described enjoying the experience of being served by enslaved waiters. And then other visitors who came to New Orleans specifically described themselves as being disgusted by the idea that in this dining room where only white diners were allowed to eat, that they would be served by servers of color. And so, it's a kind of polarizing representation of this particular, group of workers. But other sources, especially, narratives of formerly enslaved people, described using the temporary and kind of transient nature of these jobs to their advantage. That if they were perhaps on the run and escaping, fleeing from slavery, that they could dip into one of these jobs, if they were waiting to try to flee further upriver, perhaps on a steamboat toward freedom. So they were able to use the jobs to their advantage too.
Y'all, this is a fascinating conversation. And when we come back after a few messages from our advertisers, first, I want you to hit that subscribe button, and I want you to definitely tune into our other episodes. But I want you to definitely listen to our advertisers. And when we come back, we're going to talk about coffee houses in New Orleans, and we're also going to talk about Campbell's soup and gumbo. So we'll be back after a few messages.
This episode is brought to you by Plugra European-style butter, crafted for those who demand precision and exceptional results in the kitchen. With 82% butter fat and a slow churn process, Plugra gives you flakier crusts, fluffier cakes, and rich, melt-in-your-mouth pastries. Because great baking starts with great butter. Unlike standard American butters, which have only 80% butter fat, Plugra ensures the ideal moisture and fat balance so your recipes turn out just right every time. That's why professional chefs trust Plugra and home bakers love it. Plugra's slow churn process creates a smooth, creamy butter that gives dough a soft, pliable texture, making rolling, folding, and laminating effortless. Whether you're perfecting a buttery pie crust or layering a delicate croissant, Plugra helps you bake with confidence. Experience the difference for yourself. Find Plugra in stores near you or visit plugra.com. That's Plugra.com.
We're back. So, there's a myth, early on, many years ago, and I know that, New Orleans tour guides, and in any major city where there's a tourist, it's a tourist town, you have to usually pass a test to become a tour guide. And for quite some time, I would hear different tour guides and even some historians, say that the system of slavery, and I know it's changing now because we've done a lot of work, on the ground to really tell the true narrative, but that Louisiana or New Orleans slavery system was a fairer system than the rest of the U.S. because of the gens de couleur libre, or free people of color, or some formerly enslaved people who were able to buy their freedom. You're reading many firsthand accounts of enslaved persons such as Solomon Northup. Louisiana was one of the worst places to be sent to. How so?
Oh, yes. And again, in the words of people who were enslaved, who were able eventually to publish their stories, so many described the threat of being sold to Louisiana as a tool that was wielded by enslavers in the Upper South, that even the thought or the mention of being sent to Louisiana was enough to really instill enormous fear among people, because one person in particular described the threat to be sold to Louisiana as to die by inches in the cotton and the sugar fields of the state. And I can't overstate the importance of sugar cultivation and production in Louisiana. Sugarcane was first planted by French colonizers in 1795. And so it was the plant was in the soil before the soil became American. And the system of sugarcane cultivation was so excruciating and so damaging to the enslaved men who primarily, but also women who were made to work with it, that the demographics of the enslaved population in Louisiana were skewed, were different from all other slave states, just because of the degree to which the work consumed the bodies of workers, and people died so quickly who were made to work with it. So no, that's that idea that there was any kind of different situation in Louisiana is not true.
I think also it goes back to just the romanticizing of New Orleans,
Sure.
and we see that, when you think about Storyville and, how, after slavery, many soldiers came down to participate in illicit behavior with, some of our, fair skin and, white passing or, white women sex workers in Storyville, and wanting to feel that, that time period again. And so, within that community, all of these, New Orleans was a bustling economy at the time. And there's all of these, ways to entertain oneself, especially if you were a white male. And so can you talk about the coffee houses in New Orleans and paint the picture for our audience on what that was like?
Right. Yeah. So coffee houses were, one journalist observed that coffee houses sold very little coffee, that it was, these were places to drink, that it was, they were settings that were economic and social places for men to meet. And so, again, I mentioned earlier the seasonal nature of New Orleans economy, which resulted in this infusion of white men who came to the city and knew that their stay there would be bounded, would be fairly brief. And so, many observers described this kind of frenzy of buying and selling and eating and drinking. And so coffee houses were places where men could go and play billiards, read the newspapers, drink cocktails, perhaps use the baths and board there as well. And if you look at the city directories from the early years of the 19th century, you can just see this explosion in coffee houses as the city grows. It was one form of business that, they were often established maybe close to the levees where there were cotton presses and sugar storage facilities, but then, close to these big hotels as well. And so it was one form of business in New Orleans that really spoke to the male nature of the city, but then also, again, this kind of focus on consumption in multiple forms.
And New Orleans was so it was a port city, still is, and it was so pivotal to the building of the American Empire, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, but even prior. But I loved your story where you talked about the rascals. And there are some that resisted that system and found loopholes to get around it. Could you tell the story of the rascals?
Sure. Right. So the rascals were this group of 4 young men, and it was a very incendiary political event. They 3 of them, I believe, were enslaved, and one was born a free man of color. And they traveled up and down the Mississippi River, and hopping on and off steamboats, and eventually were accused and convicted of arson and murder. They were executed in St. Louis, but the 4 of them gave confessions before they were executed, and researchers have cautioned just that we should be aware of the context in which they gave these confessions, of course, just to understand that they would need to be confirmed. But these young men do describe trafficking in enslaved people, but also in stealing food and silver, and again, finding these temporary jobs as pastry cooks or as servers in hotels in New Orleans, counterfeiting money. And so it to me, trying again to find details of experiences and individual stories, this was such an unusual and unlikely source that these deathbed confessions would really shed some light on economies that were very much kind of under the radar in the city at this time, and the importance of the waterways of the river, the importance again of hotels, of food work as something that people passing in and out of the city could pick up and use to their advantage for some period of time.
You talked about Bubancha, the Choctaw term for New Orleans, which means the land of many tongues. And in my own research, and I included I think some illustrations of that in our documentary that's available on YouTube for my audience who's interested in watching it. But here's historical illustrations that I found depict images of Native women selling filet or ground sassafras, and Black women operating stalls in the French Quarter. And in your research, you shared some of this history, as I previously mentioned, but I believe, in my opinion, that WPAA narratives are not just accounts of the formerly enslaved, but they are also accounts of Native Americans. In your research, did you find any accounts of Native Americans that stood out to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out in the narratives. And I will say I did not read the narratives for that, and I would like to do that. And so I appreciate your mention of that. Studying Choctaw women and vendors, especially at the French market, which, of course, is the premier public market in the city, has a long history, but important in part because the site of the French market in New Orleans before there were Europeans, of course, that it was a place of exchange and encounter, and a marketplace in one sense among many Native nations and groups who lived in the area. And so when many travelers came to the city in the 1800s and visited the French market, unfortunately, the Choctaw vendors were very much a tourist draw to people. They were very much exoticized and described, certainly in very pejorative terms. And so one thing I did for this particular chapter, looking at the changing depictions of the French market, especially with regard to how people and food there were described, was I read successive editions of the Picayune's Guide to New Orleans, so the primary travel guide to the city, and there are very differing, evolving representation, depictions of the physical space of the market, and then the mix of people who were at the market. And you can find a clear, there's a certain trajectory to the presence of Choctaw women, especially at the market, to the point that by the early 1900s, the writers are complaining that, you know, they came to the market hoping to see these women, and that they didn't find them anymore. Or even more damaging, these observers came and claimed to find that the women that they saw, these Choctaw vendors, seemed to have intermarried with Black New Orleanians, and that was very disappointing, they claimed to these writers. So, you know, again, you can see just increasing, very sharpening kind of racist terminology and ideas, but finding, using these particular people as containers for that racism and for the ideas that they were developing about intermarriage, which of course would be really cast into larger light in the politics of the state and also the nation. But I thank you for pointing out the WPA narratives.
Yes, indeed. We talked about cookbooks and earlier, and I actually have in my possession, which I'm love to share with you one day, but the actual menus from that time period,
Nice.
from I think it was St. Louis or St. Charles Hotel.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. But anyway, so cookbooks and menus tell researchers so much about American history. And you, as an American historian, what stood out for you when you research some of these Creole cookbooks and possibly menus as well?
Sure. Well, and to be honest, that was one of the first things that struck me about coming to New Orleans and beginning the research was the extent to which many of these things have been saved and are archived in institutions. So maybe it's the cookbook collection at Tulane, or perhaps the historic New Orleans collection, or other collections in the city. And so certainly it was obvious to me that this, to the extent that there are written and material traces of this history, that city institutions have preserved them, that they have judged this to be an important element of the city's culture to preserve. And one little collection related to that theme are these recipes collected by the journalist Herman Deutsch. If this is a good time for me to mention them, this is the
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So at the library at Tulane, they have collected the papers of Herman Deutsch, who was a journalist for the Item newspaper. And there was a wonderful, very interesting series of papers in one of the folders. In 1951, the Campbell Soup Company, which was based in New Jersey, they debuted a new canned product, which was a gumbo soup. And Herman Deutsch wrote this very annoyed column in the Item, and he complained about this full-page ad that Campbell's had printed in the Saturday Evening Post. And again, the ad used all of this romantic imagery that we have been talking about. So something like a steamboat on the Mississippi River in the moonlight, and very clearly a mammy figure sitting on a hearth in New Orleans and claiming to prepare a gumbo soup. And so Deutsch was just very incensed. He said, how dare Campbell's of New Jersey claim that they can a gumbo and call it Creole. So he invited his readers to submit their recipes for their best Creole gumbo. He would run a recipe contest. And so readers sent him their recipes, and it was not an enormous collection, maybe 30 recipes or so, but it's completely fascinating to read the recipes themselves, but then also look at where the letters had come from, who the people were who had sent them to him. And so, what I found was that many people cared about gumbo and Creole gumbo and what that meant, but there were so many ideas about what a perfect gumbo was and how to make it. And, you find unexpected ingredients like ketchup or all kinds of fats to begin the roux. one writer referred to herself in the same letter as both Cajun and Creole. Others wrote from outside New Orleans to this New Orleans journalist. And so there was quite a diversity. And then to hopefully take it a step further, I took the names of those who had written to him and attempted to look in the federal census from 1950, city directories, to understand where did they live, to try to maybe estimate what their socioeconomic status was, and found a lot of diversity there too, in terms of people living in a mansion on St. Charles Street, and then also far beyond the city. But this might again have to do with the readership of this particular newspaper. All of the people who submitted recipes to him, as far as I could tell from the census, were white, and so. But it very importantly, several of those people commented that they were attempting to transcribe the recipe as it was being prepared by their cook in their kitchen. One, which was particularly telling, said, this recipe comes from, it is not professional, it comes from my cook. And then she went on to share the recipe, which of course this woman who was preparing the gumbo was, of course, a professional. She was employed to cook, to prepare this delicious dish. But the writer she said, if this gumbo is not good, it's just because I didn't write it down properly. So again, lots of ideas about oral versus textual knowledge and authority, and again, who could claim authorship of something like this iconic dish.
Listen, one thing I will set the record straight. One thing New Orleans does not play about, and Louisiana in general, is gumbo.
Right.
We have seen enough TikTok videos of people claiming, throwing hot dogs and all kind of crazy stuff. Just don't do it.
No.
Just don't do it. Please. Just come to New Orleans, and the best gumbo is, most of the time at home.
Sure,
and it passed down from generation. And there's so many different types of gumbos. There's Ninth Ward gumbo. There's Uptown gumbo. It's so many different types of gumbos. So, I don't know if a lot of you all have seen Sinners yet, the movie by Ryan Coogler, but that movie had me just in a chokehold for days. I saw it twice already. I'll probably go see it a third time. But there's a scene in Ryan Coogler's movie, and I don't know if you've seen it yet. Have you seen it yet?
No.
Okay. Well, I won't try to, but I have to ruin it again. Spoiler alert. Sure. So I'm just going to do a spoiler alert. But there's a scene in Ryan Coogler's movie Center where the actor Delroy Lindo, which is a phenomenal actor, I have to say that. I loved him in all of Spike Lee movies and on and on and on, where he gives an account of a blues man, his friend who was lynched. Coogler masterfully allows the viewer to hear the sound of lynching without the visual trauma. And in my opinion, it was an Oscar-winning performance, hands down. And he captured how the blues was the coping mechanism for the pain of Jim Crow. So how is culinary and cultural expression a coping mechanism for Black New Orleans per your research?
That's a wonderful question. And, I think among 19th century sources, and so much of this book, it tells a history that's very difficult and very, especially of an element of New Orleans culture that, again, is often pleasurable and enjoyed, and as it should be, but that it has a different kind of context, a different kind of history to it. And so, in some cases, in the 19th century, there was a woman formerly enslaved. This likely, I think, was the WPA narrative, where she described remembering how when she and others were enslaved, that they would slip out to go to the sugar house in the middle of the field at night to dance, that they would hold dances in this building, because it was a place in the middle of the night where they could be briefly safe and briefly feel joy, and that they would come back to their cabins and then get up the next morning and work, and that they needed to not appear tired either. But that was such a poignant, very small example of how communities clearly were able to wrest some kind of privacy and pleasure from a setting where their daytime reality was, of course, extremely different. In the 20th century, there are just wonderful examples of, you mentioned Chef Leah Chase, and then others like Lena Richard, people who, really used their entrepreneurial skills, their restaurants as places for again, a safe haven, political activism, for feeding their communities in ways that were, very material, but also, beyond that. And so we have just great, wonderful, rich heritages from the 20th century too, to tell those stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, so I'm not going to spoil any more scenes for you, but there was a character in Sinners, Kugler shared the story of Remick, who was an Irish vampire. When I saw the film, I was thinking for days about his character, because it was so nuanced. And the Irish and Sicilian have a long history in New Orleans, and when I saw his character, I was just thinking about, that early part of America, because I was also kind of reviewing your book at the time and preparing for this interview. Can you talk about what you wrote about Sicilian history in New Orleans?
Yes. Right. So, as you mentioned, New Orleans was an immigration port of entry. And so many Irish immigrants came to New Orleans in part to work on many of the construction projects in the city. And so the neighborhood that is now known as Irish Channel was an area of the city where many immigrants lived. Sicilians began to come to New Orleans in the latter part of the 1800s, and were very involved, especially in the food industry, in the fruit and citrus trades. And Justin Nystrom at Loyola has written a book about this history. But what becomes clear when researching the food industry during this time and different groups in the city is certainly the prejudice that Sicilians experienced at the time, that there was a clear distinction drawn between mainland or peninsular Italians and Sicilians, that the former certainly looked down on Sicilians, and so there is a interesting and troubled line between Sicilians and Black New Orleanians in these years when New Orleans is recovering from the war, segregating, when Jim Crow is being imposed on the city. Sicilians were lynched. They were segregated in similar ways, but the histories of these groups diverged. And as in other cities, as researchers have shown, there's this purposeful progression toward claiming a white identity, a white racial identity, distinct from Black New Orleanians. And so in this earlier era, there were certain commonalities and conflict, and then they diverged as time passed.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I highly suggest that my listeners read Insatiable City and also go support Sinners, Ryan Coogler, it's a very layered film. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I want to bring it now to the kind of the late 70s and 80s. And my heart just jumped when you talked about Creole Feast. Mm-hmm. And I knew the late Dr. Rudy Joseph Lombard, and he was and still is a legend here. And thankfully I was able to spend his living repast before he died of cancer. And so I'm always excited when people talk about his work, because it was so profound. And you talked about the Creole Feast, which was a festival hosted by him and Chef Nathaniel Burton. They were both co-authors of the only cookbook that paid homage to Black New Orleans chefs that once cooked and expertly managed some of the finest restaurants in New Orleans. And so I would love for you to talk about the importance of the late Dr. Rudy Joseph Lombard's work, Chef Nathaniel Burton, and everyone who was a part of that festival. I think it was during the I want you to talk about it. I won't even spoil it.
Well, yes. So as you mentioned, this book, Creole Feast, published in 1978, was just a watershed book and completely important to really opening doors that had been closed and would, as you mentioned, in many ways remain closed, to really shed light on the genius behind so many of these dishes and the restaurants and institutions that were celebrated for their Creole cuisine. And so Rudy Lombard was a civil rights lawyer. Nathaniel Burton was a longtime chef in the city, and they collaborated on this project and profiled about 15 chefs throughout the city who cooked at these different restaurants, chefs and pastry chefs. And it's a wonderful aspect of the book. They're essentially transcribed interviews, statements, narratives from directly in the words of these people who talked about their careers, about the dishes that they had created, about the ways that they this was a community of people who mentored each other, and just made so clear the extent to which they had defined Creole fine dining, Creole cuisine, and so it was an amazing book that I was I have a copy on my shelf too. It includes recipes as well, but in tandem with this book, as you mentioned, they hosted this cooking festival called Creole Feast downtown. But there's an incredible story about in one of the years that they were hosting it, that they had to delay the opening of their festival by an hour or two on a particular day because members of the Ku Klux Klan were marching just outside of the hall, the doors where this festival was being held. It was also during a large the Bayou Classic football game in the city. And so, again, to speak to the power of cuisine and culture and belonging, that a group like that felt that need to demonstrate their presence in the midst of, really celebration of culture that was, very much authored by Black New Orleanians, as it had been for so long. And so, but the book is just incredible, and I would certainly recommend readers add it to their shelves. If you have New Orleans cookbooks, that's really an essential book that should be together with others.
And I have to pay homage to the late Toni Morrison. That book would have not been possible if it wasn't for Toni Morrison. She actually published that book and worked directly with Dr. Lombard. They were dear friends. So if you look in the beginning of the book, you'll see her name. Yeah. So, to wrap this amazing conversation up, and I hope you all definitely, delve into Insatiable City. What did you, reflecting after you wrote this book, and it's been a little bit time has passed, what did you learn about Black New Orleans that stood out to you?
So much. I want to say too that I came to New Orleans as an outsider, of course, and I am an outsider, and I always will be, and so I wanted to write the book in a way that respected the story that has, again, been authored by others. And but just, again, when I started the research, I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted the book to begin or end. And I don't know about you as a researcher and writer, but that was very unsettling for me to come without a plan, and then to see the plan changing all the time. And it did become clear to me as I worked that the book really needed to go back in history and start and be very firmly planted in the antebellum era. I mean, I was came to the work primarily trained as a 20th century historian and an American studies scholar. But I think, too, what became a really wonderful and gratifying part of the process of researching and writing for me was to think always, how can I center people who were purposefully not centered in archives and in documentation, and whether it's a federal census or whether it's a municipal record that is treating somebody like a piece of property or not even mentioning them at all. As a researcher, how can you put them on the page? And not just that, but how can you let them be the speaker and the person driving the action? And I think as you mentioned, since graduate school, I've become a curator, and so I work with material culture and physical things, and I love that, because I think working with those kinds of things together with textual sources, visual sources, when we walk through the world, we experience it in multiple dimensions and multiple senses all the time, and so it made sense to me not to exclude any kinds of sources from trying to figure out what they could tell us about people of the past and present. And so I would just say too that embracing a kind of material focus, especially to the early years, really enabled me, I hope, to just to tell lots of different kinds of stories and to put the focus on people and what the work they were doing was and how they did it, in addition to the food itself.
Wonderful job. Thank you, Dr. McCulla. Thank you so much for joining us on Culture and Flavor. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. You hit that subscribe button and tune in for the rest of the season, because it's going down.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.
I'm Katie Osuna, and I'm the host of Copper and Heat Radio, a 2-time James Beard Award-winning podcast about the forces that shape our meals. I started this podcast back in 2019 when I was working in Michelin-starred restaurants and noticing all of these social interactions around me. I had a lot of questions about the culture of restaurants and the systems we operated in.
I think the restaurant world's in for a reckoning.
Restaurants are slow to change because everything's made on the smallest margins.
Value is completely arbitrary, right?
What began as a podcast to process my way through working in kitchens as a woman has grown.
If the conversation is a crackdown on the border, then do you want a $30 burger? Because that's one of the consequences of this.
There's just a certain financial reality to making certain businesses exist. And there's a reason that delivery didn't exist in a lot of markets for a lot of years. And it's because it's incredibly low margin.
How a cuisine climbs in prestige and value. This happened to Japanese cuisine. This happened to Italian cuisine right in front of our eyes.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts. And now on Heritage Radio Network.